All right, we're still at it. We're getting there, right? We're on our way to kind of not solving, because I don't believe that comes until Jesus does. The Middle East, Arab-Israeli, whatever you want to call it, conflict that's going on over there, because as we've understood, to just call it Arab-Israeli or Middle East conflict doesn't do it justice. It's just not enough to describe what's going on over there and what has been going on over there for 40-some hundred years, as best we can tell. We've been talking a good deal about the Abrahamic Epic, about Abraham, and everything that goes along with, the Isaac, Ishmael, Hagar, Sarah. Wow. Whenever you think you've got family trouble, read the Bible. There is a lot of interesting stuff, and just as an experiment, husbands, when you go to town, like you go shopping or go out to eat today, and you're worried about somebody being attracted to your wife, tell everybody she's your sister. See how that works out for you. See how that works out for you. What's that? Unless, of course, you're from, certain places in Kentucky, then it's just kind of a given.
She probably is.
Kind of a given. Anyway, so then we come, I want to conclude here rather quickly, the Isaac Ishmael thing. And I know that's hard to do because the world, and many of us have this opinion that the conflict really does have to do with Isaac Ishmael and the birthright right there. Now that's many of the claims that I will say that the Islamic traditions will say that therein lies the conflict. We know through our study that conflict goes back where?
Noah's family.
Noah's sons, Shem, Ham. That's really the problem there. And that's where this all kind of bases from. So we're in source number 2 to the issue, and that is over Isaac and Ishmael. Read the scriptures through, and you'll find out that there wasn't, I'm trying to say this the right way, there wasn't as big a conflict as we have made it. Because Abraham looks at Ishmael and says, he's my son, I love him. He's not staying here, but I love him, and they go off and they do their own thing. He creates his own tribes, the 12 tribes of Ishmael, the 12 tribes of what? Israel? All right, so it's a common thing. And so we also find out that when Abraham dies, if you read through the Genesis account, when Abraham dies, who are the two that show up to bury him with Sarah? Isaac and Ishmael. Now, Abraham had more sons, and even after Sarah dies, he has Keturah, and there are more sons with Keturah. And everything goes back to the Abraham-Sarah connection. And that's why Ishmael doesn't get the birthright. It says of all his sons, Abraham gave everything to Isaac. He gave everything to Isaac. And what that means is, you're now in charge of my entire whatever I have. Now, if that means you can offer it to other sons and other children and uncles and whatever, it's yours to do with, but you're in charge of it all. And so, really, what does that sound like? What would we call that?
An executive.
Yeah, you'll be executor of the estate. It's yours to deal with and to distribute it as seen fit. Okay? And so Isaac gets that. And unfortunately, one side of this is not super happy about it. But if you look at all the accounts, even through the historical records, and I don't mean any of the Islamic writings, you will find that there is no real battle between Ishmael and Isaac. Wow. There's no historical record that says Ishmael and the Ishmaelites until later on, because everybody gets in a fight at some point in time over ground and whatever. But the actual Ishmael and his original sons and the first kind of generations with Isaac and Ishmael, there's no real bitterness, no real conflict. There's no fights. There's none of that stuff. So where does it come from? So the 12 sons, right? they go and they produce sons, and they're to be a great group of people. The Ishmaelites, I'll show you where they lived, and then you'll see why there was battle later on. The reason why there was battle later on is because, I hate to say it this way, they forgot who they were. Like, think about that. If you were Isaac and Ishmael, and Ishmael understands it's not mine to have, and there's nothing I can do about it, right?
His sons would have known that.
His sons would have known that. This is not yours. Now, would there have been like, well, I told you the story about how we got kicked out, or, whatever. You might bring it up. But along the line, when world things change, and in their world, that was the world, okay? In that area, that was the world. And, well, we want what they have. And then we're going to say, the only way we can go claim it is by military force or by birthright. So we feel like Ishmael, Grandpa Ishmael or great-grandpa Ishmael, was the rightful heir to Abraham's stuff. So we're going to go after it. We're going to claim it that way. So basically use a birthright and a religious claim to things. That's really where those kinds of conflicts come from, not from just Isaac and Ishmael being mad at each other. It's not where it comes from. And so we have this made-up epic later on through Islamic writings that create a much greater conflict than what there really was. And then you have to make claims, if you're going to make those claims through birthright or for religious purposes, that really it was Abraham and Ishmael that were together. The Islamic writings will write that Ishmael was the one on the altar ready to be sacrificed, not Isaac. Okay, so if that's the case, because it says his only son, right? Take your son, your only son. Well, they will claim Ishmael was the only son. He was the first. Okay, so you see where these, then you kind of have to fabricate it. You kind of have to put this all together so that you can lay claim to that which you don't have claim to. And you know you don't have claim to it. So anyway, I want to leave that there. I want to leave the Abraham, Isaac, Ishmael thing. When Hagar and Ishmael leave out and they go off on their own, I'll tell you where they settle. I'll show you that on a map. And when they do that, it says, the Bible tells us that Hagar found an Egyptian woman for Ishmael to marry. So Hagar's Egyptian. Abraham was not. Okay. So Ishmael is half and half. Huh? He's a sham, as Dale made up the word sham. A Shemite and a Hamite. He's a sham. So after they're kicked out, he marries an Egyptian girl. So you see where the line falls apart, right? We're even further away from being a Semite at that point. So the Ishmaelites were not Semites. They had this little tiny sliver that they could claim from a maidservant to Abraham, an Egyptian maidservant to Abraham, and then the line all the way from there on out to the sons are Egyptian and people from the Sinai. So let's take a look at that. Genesis 25:18. And they, the Ishmaelites, dwelt in Havilah unto Shur, that is before Egypt, as thou goest toward Assyria, and he died in the presence of all his brethren. Now, the reason why I want to show you this map is I want you to see some things. Okay? You got Shur. You can see it up. Sure, you can see that, right? Yeah. You see the word Israel. Right below that is Shur. It says that they lived from where to where? Havilah over to Shur. The alternate Shur is, well, you can see current day Jordan, right? Now, there's this famous place. How many of you saw the movie Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade? Seen that one? Where do they end up? What's the name of the place that they end up with finding the Grail? We know it today as Petra. There's basically an entire city that was carved out of stone. Temples, the whole bit, all carved out of stone. And there is in this crescent valley. Okay? There's this crescent valley in the southern part of Jordan. in this area, you would say, somewhere just north or around that area of alternate Shur. So below Amman, to the east of Shur, north of alternate Shur. This is the area that the Ishmaelites existed in. And they were mostly in the Sinai, which where it says Shur, that little peninsula triangle right there is the Sinai Peninsula. Okay? What do you see below all that in the lighter color? That's the Arabian Peninsula. What are the two cities that you see, or three cities that you see just to the left of the word Saudi Arabia? Mecca, Medina, and Jeddah. Okay? Now, do those names sound familiar to you? At least one of them probably should, right?
For sure.
Mecca, right? Now, there is another word that is sometimes used for the word Mecca. It is Makkah, but that does not occur in this area. It occurs way up in the north into Iran and Assyria near Baghdad. Now, does that make sense? If there's a possibility that there is this town called Makkah where a guy maybe by the name of Muhammad lived, and that place is closer to Baghdad, look where the Ishmaelites used to live. You see that red line? Where does the red line go through? That same area, right? There is zero, absolutely, positively, no evidence that if you can prove that there was a guy by the name of Muhammad who ever even existed on the planet, there is zero evidence that he was ever in a place called Medina, Mecca, or Jeddah. Zero. No archaeological evidence, no written evidence, no historical evidence, no geological evidence, no geographical evidence. There is zero evidence of that until the 9th century AD.
And when did he live?
632.
BC.
Okay.
No, AD.
Was it 80?
Yeah, AD.
So it's 300 years later.
Yeah, it's 300, almost 300 years after he dies is when many of the first Islamic writings and a lot of this history of those Islamic writings come about. Now, it's not debatable. the evidence is there. Okay, that's just all there is to it. Now, the first iterations of the Quran come about 125 to 170 years after he dies. Now, and the reason why this is an issue is if you ask most Muslims who wrote the Quran, they have a hard time telling you anything other than it's God. God wrote it. That's their pat answer. That's the answer they're told to give is God wrote it. And then they go to the Holy Bible and they say, who wrote that? Who will they say wrote the Bible? Man.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, man wrote that. They'll even understand that it is inspired by God, but man wrote it. When it comes to the Quranic writings, they will say God wrote that. And you ask, well, who penned it? It's God's words. It's God's words. They can't, they're not permitted to answer that a human being put God's words down on paper. Okay? And that's why you run into the problems where, like with the genealogy issue for Muhammad, he forbade people to go back any further than 13 generations in his history and his genealogy. You're not allowed to look any further than 13 generations back. But yet they had to tie back to Ishmael to claim Abraham, to claim the promised land. Now, why would they want the promised land if this is where he thinks they live? In fact, if you look about where they lived, the Ishmaelites, where did they ever live? Never there. In fact, when he was with Abraham, Abraham was south of that in Hebron, in the Negev. They were never in Israel. They were never there. The biblical accounts say that. The Islamic accounts say that. All of the accounts never indicate that Ishmael or Muhammad were ever in any of those places. And how do they lay claim to it? They have to connect back to Abraham to get the blessing, to get the birthright. Okay? All right, I'm going to leave that. So you guys got kind of an idea what's going on here? I can tell you guys are sleepy and really doing good here. All right, this is where I want to show you where everything that we're talking about was. Abraham, this is the places where he landed. You look down here on the bottom, Kadesh Barnea. This is the first place that Abraham sends Hagar and Ishmael off to. Okay, just to the right is Edom. So this area around, right in between Negev, or the Negev as we call it, and Edom, that is now Jordan that we saw in the previous. You see that? See what we're talking about? That's the geography there. This is where they were sent. If you read the story, you find that they went out into the desert, and she put the child under a tree and went away so she could hear. She walked away so she couldn't hear her son die crying. That's the biblical account. That the account in Islam is what? That they end up down. That they end up in Mecca, and she finds that Ishmael is dying of thirst, so she starts running between the two mountains, sprinting between two mountains. My son's dying of thirst, so I'm going to run between two mountains. Sound like a good idea, girls? I mean, the biblical account says that she put him under a tree and walked away because she couldn't hear him. Didn't want to hear him die. Didn't want to stand there and watch him die. Okay? This says they went down to Mecca. Now, do you see an issue? She was given enough water and food to basically walk away just from that area. And they went to Kadesh, according to the Bible, they went to Kadesh Barnea, which is not terrible distance away. Now, if you went from Kadesh Barnea down to Mecca, you die. You don't just walk through there. Okay? That's just not how it works. It's a ridiculous notion. And the fact that they say that at some point in time, Abraham takes Ishmael to Mecca and builds the Kaaba over the top of the spring that his mother found when she was running between the two mountains. That's the Islamic narrative. She was running between the two mountains, and suddenly God revealed to her a spring. And the spring gave them water, and everything was fine, and they called the water Zappa Zappa. I'm not making that up. Zappa Zappa. Okay? And you can go to Mecca right now, and you can buy Zappa Zappa water. In fact, you can sit right where you are and order it online.
Have it tomorrow.
You can have it tomorrow. Amazon will get you your Zappa Zappa water tomorrow. I am quite serious.
Oh, okay.
I am quite serious. And there's a small issue with that. There are millions upon millions of people who on a regular basis, we are in the time of Ramadan, so there are tons and tons of people on their way to Mecca to circle the Kaaba. They go in a counterclockwise motion around the Kaaba, which is supposedly in 2100 BC in Mecca, where Abraham went down and built a temple over the top of a spring that Hagar found while she was running between two mountains. And that is where Abraham settled, according to Islamic tradition. They settled in Mecca with Ishmael over the top of Zappa Zappa. I'm not making it up. They are. Okay? Now, how you can get your Zappa Zappa water right now? Anybody know how? Well, look where Mecca and Jeddah is. Right next to where? The Red Sea, which is pretty salty. Okay? The three largest desalination plants in the world, right near Jeddah. And then there's this really big piping system that goes from Jeddah to Mecca. And it pipes desalinated water down into the stuff, the mechanicals, underneath the Zappa Zappa well. And then it's pumped up to everybody else who comes to get Zappa Zappa water.
If you order it from Amazon, there's probably some guy in New Jersey with a water hose.
Because if you go to Mecca right now and you drink some Zappa Zappa water, you go, it's kind of salty. There's a reason for that. It's desalinated water from the Red Sea, not from a well. There is no feasible way. And if you say there's no feasible way, what is the Islamic response? God provides. God provides. Well, sure he does, right there from the Red Sea in a desalination plant. Just double checking. It's kind of sweet. All right, so there we go. Into the Negev. That's where we're at. Okay, now there are some places mentioned where it talks about where Abraham settled with his family. There's Hebron, Gerar, and Arad. Okay, there's some places that are mentioned in the Genesis account. But you see way up to the left, little section, Gaza. This is the area we're talking about. Now, the other place that it says that the Ishmaelites basically went no further south than was a place called Paran. Now, do you see where that's at? See the Sinai to the left. You see Eilat, Paran. You see other sections. This whole region was Paran, and this is basically the area of the Ishmaelites. The Sinai Peninsula, where you'll find later on one of the tribes was the Midianites. Who are the Midianites? Remember when Moses is kicked out of Egypt and he crosses over into the Sinai? Who does he come across and marry one of? He marries a Midianite shepherd girl, right? Yeah. From the tribe of Midian, from the tribe of Ishmael. There you go. So Moses marries a little Ishmaelite girl. And so therefore, some of the others will claim Moses the lawgiver connected to Ishmael. His descendants connected to Ishmael. See what we're doing here? Man, it's easy to make stuff up when you want to shove it into this, round hole, square peg kind of thing, right? Okay. But there is, again, no evidence that down below that there were ever Ishmaelites in that area. And there's a reason for that. There's a reason for that. Look at that area. This is a topographical map of that area. How many of you look like you've got a spot picked out where you want to build your cabin? Below the line of Paran. Anybody?
It's kind of rough.
It is very, very, very rough. In fact, along the Red Sea, there's not even a whole lot that's really great territory until you get all the way down to Jeddah, and that's not great, or all the way down to Yemen. Now, guess who lives in the land of Yemen at this time? Hamites down the line. So you remember the Cush and all the other, look at them, right? Look at them over here. All the big line of Ham. They all end up in Egypt and Ethiopia and Libya and all those areas, and then they migrate across the Red Sea, some of them do, over to a place we now know as Yemen. Okay? So there's nobody living between Yemen and Paran. There's no archaeological, no geological, no historical evidence of anybody residing in those places until after the time of Jesus. Only one other city in that entire area, and it's along the coast. And it's definitely not Mecca, and it's not Medina. None of those places. Do you see where things are kind of falling apart for the argument? Okay, we're going to keep going. I see some droopy eyes, so I'm going to try to keep moving here. So I've got a really fun thing. This would be your time. If you really ever wanted to nap, this is the time to do it. Okay? This is I was going to try to explain all this because we want to move on to the idea about Palestine. Okay? And so there's this, again, a misnomer that Palestine and the Philistines are same. So what you're going to see in this video is the history, all the stuff that goes along with the Canaanites, all the way through to what we now know as Palestine and who those people might be and how this all came about. The part that is really interesting is where the Philistines actually come from what we know from archaeology and history. So if we can see if we can do this here.
Where are the Philistines? The short answer. The Philistines were an ancient people who lived on the southeastern shore of the Mediterranean during the Late Bronze to Early Iron Age. Their civilization was centered around the Pentapolis, the 5 cities of the Philistines: Ashdod, Ashkelon, Ekron, Gath, and Gaza. The land that this confederation of city-states inhabited is known as Philistia. The Philistines are most known for their role in the biblical narrative, where they are the longtime rival of the Hebrew tribes and their later kingdoms. A little bit of context. Long before Philistia was founded, the region was inhabited by the Canaanites. They were the indigenous people who lived along much of the eastern Mediterranean coast. The Canaanites were predominantly descended from the Neolithic farmers and city dwellers that had lived there long before written history began. Peoples from Mesopotamia and Anatolia also migrated and assimilated into the Canaanite population. Through conflict, migration, and trade, Mesopotamian culture was the most significant outside influence on the early Canaanite civilizations. That was followed by an increase in Egyptian influence, especially in southern Canaan. Egypt's first foothold in the region was a fortress built at the strategic choke point where Gaza would later be built. The site controlled the entry and exit point for the easiest but still very difficult land route to Egypt. During the Middle Kingdom period of Egypt's history, pharaohs campaigned in Canaan for the first time. They plundered cities, extracted tribute, and made trade agreements there. As Egypt exploited Canaan for its resources, many Canaanites had a thought. Hey, Egypt seems like a nice place to live right now. So many moved to Egypt. During the later Middle Kingdom, the mass migration of Canaanites to the Nile Delta seems to have been mostly peaceful, at least at first. Later, the Egyptian Middle Kingdom was overthrown by the Hyksos,
Make sure
a
you keep
foreign
paying
group
attention to the
that was
dates,
either
okay?
completely made up of Canaanite newcomers, or in large
Abraham
part,
is somewhere around
after a
2000 to
century of
2100
Hyksos
BC.
domination of Egypt and rule of the Nile Delta, they were defeated and Egypt reunited. The new Egyptian kingdom that emerged was far more militaristic than any that had come before it. Their main foreign policy goal was to dominate Canaan. They were successful. Egyptian armies moved at will throughout Canaan. They built fortresses and removed uncooperative kings, who were replaced with more friendly and pro-Egyptian successors. In addition to creating a large buffer zone against invading enemies, control of Canaan also brought control of trade, which created a lucrative source of revenue for Egypt. During the 15th century BC, the city of Gaza was built as an Egyptian administrative and trade center, managed by an Egyptian royal governor. Egypt controlled Canaan for more than 3 centuries, although it did occasionally lose control and dealt with periodic rebellions. Despite the heavy-handed Egyptian rule, there were some benefits, especially for the southwestern coastal plain. For the hundreds of years the Egyptian Empire controlled the region, it was far from the front lines of Egypt's wars with neighboring empires to the north, like the Mitanni and Hittite empires. This allowed the region to focus on productivity and commerce. Numerous
See those evil
unwalled
Elamites over
agricultural
there?
settlements and cities thrived there. The city of Ashdod became a commercial hub for producing and selling purple fabric and clothing. Ashkelon developed into a busy seaport, while all of southern Canaan became a bustling thoroughfare, as it was the last stop for merchants on both the busiest land and sea routes to Egypt. There, merchants could relax and stock up on some of the local Canaanite wine, filling any empty space they had in their ship or caravan before heading to Egypt, where they could exchange their various goods for gold. Mycenaean merchants from what is now Greece would have been among the most frequent visitors to southern coastal Canaan. This is evidenced by the large numbers of Mycenaean pottery found in the region. At the beginning of the 12th century BC, southwestern Canaan was one small, prosperous component within a large, interconnected system of empires. And the good times were about to abruptly end. Chapter 3, the Bronze Age Collapse and the Rise of the Philistines. In the early 12th century BC, the old international order dramatically collapsed. In the span of a few decades, ancient empires were reduced to rubble. Prosperity gave way to desolation, and a golden age gave way to a dark one. This devastating event had many causes, including, but not limited to, drought, famine, disease, civil unrest. and region-wide prolonged imperial conflicts. But by far the most dramatic, enigmatic, and emblematic contributing factor to the collapse was the mysterious maritime piratical band of apocalyptic marauders known as the Sea Peoples. They left a swath of destruction along the coast of the eastern Mediterranean, which culminated in the failed invasion of Egypt. In their final assault on the Nile Delta, one of the Sea Peoples, called the Peliset, appear to have been the most numerous, based on how many times they are mentioned in inscriptions and the frequency they are depicted on temple wall reliefs. After the Egyptian victory, Ramses III stated that he resettled captured Peliset prisoners of war in southwestern Canaan. The Peliset were garrisoned in fortresses, bound in Pharaoh's name. The intended goal was that the Peliset would guard Egypt's northeastern border. There, the descendants of the Peliset became the Philistines. Chapter 4. Where did the Peliset come from? And what happened to the Canaanites who were living in southwestern Canaan before? 3 decades before the final Sea People's assault on the Nile Delta, the pharaoh Merneptah also defeated a major Sea People's coalition, which did not include the Peliset. Around the same time, Merneptah also campaigned with his army in Canaan. There, he mentions the sack of 3 rebellious cities, including Ashkelon, which was one of the leading Canaanite cities of the time. Interestingly, he also makes the claim that during his campaign in Canaan, Israel is laid waste, and his seed is not. Although apparently exaggerating, this is significant, because the Merneptah inscription is the oldest written artifact mentioning Israel, which is not mentioned as a city, country, or region, but as a foreign people group, as signified by the hieroglyphic determinative of a throw stick beside male and female seated figures. Although Merneptah may have also slightly exaggerated when he stated that Canaan has been plundered into every sort of woe, it is safe to say that at least some of Canaan was not in great shape after Merneptah's campaign. From the archaeological record, it is apparent that almost all of the cities, towns, hamlets, and small settlements on the southwestern coastal plain were destroyed immediately before, during, or after the first decades of the 12th century BC. So what happened to the Canaanites of the coastal plain? Well, most of them died. But it should be strongly emphasized that not all of them died. And even though only a small percentage of the earlier dense population of the coastal plain survived, they were still more numerous than the newly arrived Peliset. The vast majority of scholars today believe that the Peliset originated somewhere around the Aegean Sea, with the island of Crete being the most popular option, but more on that later. Chapter 5. Settlement. Modern estimates for the Peliset population at the time of their settlement in Canaan range anywhere from only a few thousand to a little more than 10,000 settlers. In contrast, Ramses claims to have captured and resettled hundreds of thousands. As with many things that concern the Philistines, there's a great deal of scholarly disagreement concerning Ramses III's claim to have resettled the captured Peliset in his strongholds. The traditional view is that these strongholds evolved into the 5 cities of the Philistines. There is some evidence to support this, like at Ashkelon, where resettlement began on the ruins of the Egyptian fort there. This could also fit in the scenario where the Peliset were the ones that destroyed the fort, or the fort could have been destroyed during Merneptah's campaign in Canaan when he sacked Ashkelon, and the Peliset later reoccupied the abandoned ruin. Because the 5 cities of the Philistines were situated along the road of Horus, which was vital to Egypt's military and economic success, it has been called into question whether Egypt voluntarily resettled the Peliset in such a precarious position. Some have hypothesized that the Peliset either conquered southern Canaan not long before or after their assault on the Nile Delta, and Egypt just lied and claimed that's all part of the plan. However, it is unlikely that Egypt would try to get away with such a blatant lie. It is more likely that they just tried to stretch the truth a little bit. Another possibility is that a bankrupt and war-weary Egypt negotiated a truce with the surviving Peliset. If both were not strong enough to benefit from continuing to fight, perhaps, in return for captured prisoners of war, the Peliset would pay a token tribute to Egypt and accept the status of being an Egyptian vassal. If such an agreement took place, both parties received the benefit of recognition and legitimacy. This made Egypt falsely appear stronger and more stable, while the Philistines received the prestige and legitimacy that came along with being the agent of the empire that had controlled Canaan for centuries. Again, if such a negotiation or something similar took place, then most that heard Ramses III's lofty boasts probably believed them, because it wasn't so far off from the truth or the word on the street. In addition to possibly negotiating with the Egyptians, the Peliset almost certainly successfully negotiated with the Canaanite survivors. From what has been excavated so far at the Philistine sites, it is abundantly clear that in addition to a new foreign element in the material culture, a local Canaanite population was an integral part of every Philistine settlement from its emergence. The current general consensus is that at least 50% of the early population at these sites were Canaanites. It is possible that the Philistine settlements were established under Egyptian supervision or encouragement. However, given Egypt's internal turmoil and economic woes in the 12th century BC, their involvement was likely minimal at best, if at all. After their failed assault on Egypt, another one of the Sea Peoples, the Tejeker, established themselves at the city of Dor, which they used as a base for their piratical operations for over a century. Some of the Tejeker that the Egyptians captured also seem to have been settled in what became the Philistine cities. Because the Peliset were formidable warriors, they would have been able to offer protection to some of the Canaanite survivors of the coastal plain. In return, they would have benefited from the extra manpower and the local knowledge of their new homeland. In the Egyptian depiction of the Battle of the Delta, there are a few ox carts shown with women and children inside. So it appears there would have at least been some females and a few whole families that arrived with the Peliset. However, given the turbulent times and the great distance traveled, it is likely that a disproportionate number of the Peliset were adult males. Consequently, when the Peliset initially settled in Canaan, finding wives was probably a top priority after survival, which would have motivated them to negotiate with and incorporate anyone who had extra daughters. The speed that both Peliset and Canaanite cultures joined together to become a new Philistine culture is remarkable. This was undoubtedly expedited out of necessity, but another likely factor that aided the two peoples joining together so quickly was that they already knew each other well. Chapter 6. The Aegean Connection. For centuries, merchants from the Aegean had been traveling to southern Canaan. Because of this, there were likely some Canaanite survivors that were able to communicate in the Peliset language and were familiar with their cultural customs, and vice versa as well. Almost every time in history there are long-term commercial contacts between two peoples, there is also intermarriage. It is very possible that prior to the Bronze Age collapse, there was already a small hybrid Aegean and Canaanite community and culture in the region. The survivors from this community may have sped up the assimilation process between the two larger groups. One of the most solid pieces of evidence that suggests at least a partial Aegean ancestry for the Philistines is their pottery. The striking similarity between Mycenaean pottery from the Aegean and Philistine pottery in form, style, and decoration is unmistakable. In some pieces, the only way to detect a difference is that the Philistine pottery is made from local clay and not from Aegean clay. This piece of evidence on its own is not conclusive. Some have argued in the near post-apocalyptic aftermath of the Bronze Age collapse, the surviving Canaanites missed the Aegean pottery they used to import so much that they began to manufacture an imitation of it locally, which is possible, but unlikely. In addition to fascinating pottery fragments, Philistine architecture also had some elements that suggest an Aegean origin. While earlier Canaanite homes cooked their food in closed ovens, Philistine homes cooked their meals over a centrally placed open circular hearth in the same manner as Aegean homes. What the Philistines ate, again, suggests an Aegean origin. While digging through ancient Philistine garbage piles, archaeologists have discovered an unusually large amount of pig bones. The type of pig was not previously native to the Levant, but it was a native of the Aegean. In contrast to cows, sheep, and other livestock, pigs do quite well at sea. They are hardy, low maintenance, and great at cleaning up any biological waste all over the ship. The many Philistine pork dinners may be directly related to their nautical origin as sea peoples. Or, the swine could have been imported not long before the Bronze Age collapse, but it is another piece of evidence that points towards an Aegean connection. The clothing, arms, and armor of the Peliset also suggest but do not confirm an Aegean origin, like their iconic headgear. While helmets like these were used in the Aegean, similar helmets were first used in Mesopotamia. As they slowly went out of style in the east, they became fashionable in the West. One theory about the Peliset is that they were members of a mercenary warrior cult, as similar headgear was most often depicted on gods or priests. According to the biblical account, a tribe of Canaanites called the Avites lived on the southern coastal plain before the Philistines arrived from Caphtor. The Avites are later listed as living among the Philistines. Most scholars identify Caphtor as Crete, but Caria, Cilicia, and Cyprus are also popular options. Cyprus has a compelling case for being the homeland or the last stop for the Peliset before coming to Canaan. Like southern Canaan, Cyprus was a long-time trading partner of the Mycenaeans, who would have been very familiar with the island. In times of danger, people often flee to somewhere familiar. During and after the collapse of the Kingdom of Wallachia, many Mycenaeans fled their own collapsing society to live on Cyprus. Mycenaeans, Cypriots, or a combination of both, might have been one and the same with the Peliset, and maybe one or the other was the Chijeker. Criticism of the Aegean connection. Two of the best arguments that the Peliset were not from the Aegean region is that there is no clear evidence of Aegean influence on Philistine language or religion. The gods that the Philistines worshipped, Baal, Astaroth, and Dagon, were already worshipped in Canaan before the arrival of the Peliset. One obvious answer to why the Peliset abandoned their old, possibly Greek gods, is that they lived through the traumatic collapse of their own civilization, and then they suffered the humiliation of defeat at the hands of the Egyptians. Some would have been made slaves, their most beautiful women taken as trophies, and even more would have died along the way or in battle. The tiny group of survivors just likely lost faith in the gods of their fathers. Additionally, many ancient peoples viewed gods as being tied to a specific geographic territory, so they may have just believed that their old gods had no power in the land they settled in. As for the language, this could be explained by 1. We know very little of the Philistine language, so maybe there was some words that linked to Mycenaean Greek, Luwian, or another Aegean language, but we just don't know about it. 2. The Peliset saw the advantage of mastering the Canaanite language, which some of them probably already knew, so they could negotiate better. 3. While the Philistine men farmed their fields, drank wine with their friends, and waged war on their enemies, Philistine women, many of whom were probably of Canaanite origin, taught their children to speak and worship the Canaanite gods. Most other theories not mentioned here heavily or completely rely on linguistic similarities to place names and the Peliset. Out of the many possible homelands for the Peliset, somewhere near the Aegean fits best, given the current evidence. In the collapse of the Bronze Age empires, a complete restructuring of society took place. Nomads moved into the ruins of cities, and some surviving city dwellers took on a nomadic way of life. While in most areas of the Near East, a nomadic pastoralist lifestyle became the most common, one of the few places where urban life recovered and thrived was along the eastern coast of the Mediterranean. For centuries, heavy-handed imperial administrations regulated and taxed the flow of trade that went through Canaan. Following the Bronze Age collapse, independent city-states became the leading traders as Egypt gradually abandoned the region in the 12th century BC. Even though at first there was only a small trickle of trade flowing through the region compared to the traffic of earlier times, it was more profitable for small independent traders like the Philistines. Their fortified settlements rapidly expanded into cities, and their soldiers filled the power vacuum left by the Egyptians on the coastal plain. All of the Philistine cities were situated close to some of the best farmland in the region. In contrast to earlier Canaanite cities, where the farming communities that supported the city were spread out over a large area, Philistine farmers lived in the city, and their cultivated land was nearby. This city plan reflected the times, where marauders and invaders were a much more likely occurrence, and protecting farmers was a higher priority. The Philistines were an industrious people. Not only did they tax trade going to Egypt, they produced large amounts of wine and olive oil for export. Ekron, which was a small settlement during Canaanite times, developed into a large production center for olive oil. At Ekron, 115 large olive oil presses have been excavated, which would have produced many tons more of olive oil than they could have needed for personal consumption. By the beginning of the 11th century BC, Philistia was one of the most rapidly recovering regions in the entire Near East, while most other regions were still in turmoil. Although over time, there were a few other Philistine settlements and cities, political and economic power was concentrated in the Pentapolis. The League of City-States was governed by a council of 5 lords, They gathered to deliberate on matters where collective action might be necessary. For most of the 11th century BC, the Philistines dominated the entire Canaanite coastal plain. According to the biblical account, the Philistines were able to defeat and vassalize the Hebrew tribes to their north and east multiple times, in one instance for 40 years. This was partially due to the Philistines' technological advantage. They had chariots which were very effective on the flat coastal plain, but not so much in the hills. And they enjoyed an early monopoly on iron weapons in the region. Iron armor and weapons would have been a significant advantage over the bronze armor and weapons used by the Hebrews and the other people in the region. One of the major motivating factors for the Philistines to expand their territory eastwards would have been the control of trade routes. In addition to the sea route, if the Philistines controlled all the major land routes going to Egypt, they could charge significantly higher tariffs. Philistine aggression and expansionist aspirations probably played a role in the Hebrew tribes uniting into a kingdom. According to the book of Samuel, Israel's first king Saul was killed in battle against the Philistines. Before Saul's death, his successor David, famous for killing a large fellow from Gath, fled Saul and lived in Gath. There he worked as a mercenary for the Philistines. Interestingly, after becoming king, David had 600 Philistines from Gath in his personal retinue, in addition to some Cherethites and some Pelethites, who some think are a subset of Philistines. When David's son rebelled, and he had to flee Jerusalem, his Philistine soldiers were some of the few that remained loyal to him. Even though the Philistines are most well known for being the frequent antagonists in many of the Bible's most intense narratives, the many, not as exciting instances of cooperation, collaboration, and somewhat peaceful coexistence are often overlooked. Intermarriage between the two groups is mentioned as being common, and in contrast to most of the other Canaanites, intermarriage with the Philistines was not outright banned, although it was frowned upon. In the early 10th century, Philistine territory shrank to around its core region. The loss of the port of Joppa was a major blow to the Philistines. This allowed merchants to easily bypass the Philistine coast on their way to Egypt, including the Canaanites to the north, who were allied with the Hebrews. Today, these Canaanites are more commonly known by their Greek name, Phoenicians. Their commercial ascendancy coincided with a slow Philistine economic decline. The 10th century BC also saw the split between Israel and Judah, and a short-lived but triumphant return of Egypt under the Libyan pharaoh Shoshenq. He sacked cities and collected tribute throughout Canaan before returning to Egypt with a large caravan full of loot. A few decades later, at the beginning of the 9th century BC, the Aramean king, Hazael of Damascus, successfully campaigned against Israel, Judah, and Philistia, where he destroyed the city of Gath, which never fully recovered afterwards and became a dependency of Ashdod. Over the next century, Philistia gradually recovered, and then the Judeans successfully besieged Ashdod and Gath and destroyed their city walls. And then the Assyrians showed up. They destroyed the kingdom of Israel and made Judah a tributary. In the later 8th century, Assyria took the Philistine cities one by one. Puppet states were set up at Ekron, Ashkelon, and Gaza. Ashdod became a fully incorporated Assyrian province, while Gath became a backwater. Under Assyrian rule, Philistia had a much better 7th century than its 8th. As Assyria controlled the whole region, Philistia got down to business and did well. That is, until the very end of the 7th century. As the Assyrian Empire was beginning to fall apart, Gaza sought to assert its independence. Then Egypt, which was trying to assert its loyalty to Assyria, sacked Gaza. Then, the Babylonian Empire that superseded the Assyrian invaded Philistia. Nebuchadnezzar II of Babylon destroyed Ekron and Ashdod. The port city of Ashkelon was the last to hold out against Nebuchadnezzar, before also being destroyed. Nebuchadnezzar deported some of the Philistine population to Babylon. This allowed the Phoenician Canaanites to come in and fill the void. Over the following centuries, the new amalgamated population that formed lost all of its Philistine characteristics, while the region was dominated by a series of empires. After unsuccessfully revolting against the Romans, Judea was renamed Palestine, after their old nemesis. The Philistines are often a footnote in other people's histories, so I wanted to do a little bit of a longer video, just focused on them. This has been Epimetheus. A big thanks to my patrons and to you for watching.
All right, so does that, I'm gonna turn it back on, does that give you kind of a better?
That was all DC, right?
Yeah. Everybody get their nap in while they're watching that, so that's good.
Several of them.
Okay, so I didn't think that I could just show you maps and do that justice on my own in 24 minutes, because I found myself going off in different ways. So I like that video, very clear. So you can see that the idea that the Philistines were the Palestinians, and the Palestinians are the one, you see what I'm saying? You see where the connections fall apart? So when there's this claim in Palestine, which was a Roman made-up word based off Philistia and the Peliset, all of these, they crammed them all together, and basically the Romans were making fun of the Judeans and saying, okay, we'll just call your whole area over somebody you don't like. That's why it was called that. That was the Romans' way of putting their thumb on top of the Judeans, of the Israelites people. That was their way of just basically subjugating them. So the reason why that whole area is called Palestine is because of the Romans making fun of Jews. Okay? And it's not the Philistines, because as you saw, the Phoenicians and other groups come in and basically run the Philistines off, and the Philistines basically disappear into history. So the Philistines didn't, after that last Roman and Phoenician conquering, the Philistines don't exist. Okay? Now, the Canaanites, you can see the Canaanites started in that area, intermingled with the Philistines, and then kind of migrated up into Lebanon, where you saw Phoenicia. Okay, so that's where they ended up, and then they come back down, and here's the thing: if there is any group of people, and we're talking about specifically around the Gaza Strip, when we say the Gaza Strip, that includes those 5 cities that you kept talking about. We're getting built and then sacked. When it says sacked, that means when we say ransacked, that means they were destroyed. Okay, so these cities are sacked. If you go through the archaeological of many of the major cities, like say for instance, you go to Edinburgh, Scotland, and you walk on the streets, you are dozens of feet above the original streets in Edinburgh, Scotland. The reason being is Edinburgh has been completely sacked multiple times. And if you sack a city like Gaza or Ashkelon or someplace like that, and you sack it, no problem, you just bring in everything and level it all off and build on top of the rubble. That's how you rebuild a city. You didn't go say, I wonder where the foundation was for this place, and reset all the rocks back to it. No, you just level it all off, build on top of that. Many of the streets in Jerusalem are not the original level at the streets in Jerusalem. The Romans came and destroyed, Jerusalem's been destroyed multiple times. All right? So it's not like everything is right where it was and you're walking on the same streets. This is rebuilt stuff on top of rebuilt stuff. You saw how many times it says they sacked this city and they tore down this city and they rebuilt this city and this was a fort and they tore that down. None of it is the same. None of it. Okay? It just doesn't exist anymore. About the only city that's still kind of in that region that even exists kind of the way it used to be is Damascus. Damascus is one of those cities that never really got sacked and destroyed. It just keeps existing. Partially because Damascus is not in a great area that everybody really wants. So you don't go sack it. Who cares, right? So anyway, that's kind of the idea about the Philistines and the Palestinian connection. Roughly, there is none. I hated to give you a 24-minute video to tell you that there is none. But that's roughly how it is. We're running up on time, but any quick questions about the 2 things we've discussed? I wanted to finish up the Isaac Ishmael thing and show you the video on the Philistines.
Were the Philistines essentially Egyptians and...
No, the Philistines were Aegean. They were Greeks, Mycenaeans.
Okay.
Possibly, likely, as you saw in the video, from the island of Crete. Have you ever heard of somebody being called a Cretan? You know what that means?
Oh, it's a negative.
It's a very negative thing because of people like that is discussed. Cretans are basically referred to as these barbaric, inhumane, conquering, mercenary type people who were just bloodlusting, and that was how Cretans were described. And so that would kind of make sense for these sea people who were basically marauders. So they were like the early Vikings, basically. They just went, ransacked everything, and then took over where they could. And if they couldn't, they just steal everything they could and run off. And so they did a really wise thing, because if you look down the Gaza Strip there, you saw to transport any kind of goods and services in that time, and even pretty much today, you have to go through the Gaza Strip, or you have to sail into that area. Okay? So it's very strategic as far as that goes, as far as trade and as far as military, that area is strategic. So do you think it's more likely on a lot of these cases that it is a matter of trade and military than it is religious purposes? I mean, there's the big deal, is it's a claim to religious rights or land rights. Well, why are they claiming any of it? Well,
Trade, money.
money and power. Isn't that what it comes down to? Money and power. So that's the Philistines. They're not Palestinians. Palestinian was a made-up word by the Romans to make fun of the Jews.
So it sounds like you're just a whole lot of cultures just intermingling
Yeah, in and out.
through all these years.
Yes.
You recap that when I'm not sleep deprived.
Yes. No. You can watch it on YouTube. We'll have it up here shortly. So, any other questions, comments, jokes of the day, rude remarks? Anything else? All right. Thank you, guys. Next week we will get into actually into Islam. Okay.